Welcome back to the last of our talks on George Whitefield and the Evangelical Revival. I hope you're inspired, I hope you're encouraged, and I hope that you're learning a few things about both Whitefield and the other great pioneers at this great time when the Lord walked the land. And we pray that that may happen again. Of course, there have been other instances of revival since, but our concentration is on the great revival of the 18th century and George Whitefield's role within it. And in this last talk, we're going to talk about Whitefield and the Countess of Huntington, seeing a little bit about her role in the revival as one of Whitefield's close confidants. Well, the evangelical revival had a profound and lasting effect upon English culture and society, as well as the church. I mean, some would say that it prevented revolution. Indeed, there are those that say that the reason the French had a revolution and England didn't is that England had a revival. Well, I don't know about that, but there was a rather famous prayer meeting in 1759 when John Wesley, George Whitefield and the Countess of Huntington all came together to pray against the French. However, upon the spiritual and religious health of the nation, the effect of the revival was nothing short of transformational. Just think back to what I've been talking about, the numbers affected, the thousands upon thousands upon thousands coming under the word of life. Don't let any historian ever seek to persuade you the revival didn't happen or didn't matter. And at the heart of the revival were many well-known and lesser-known figures. Now, in the case of Selina, the Countess of Huntingdon, 1707 to 1791, the name is known, but not so much of her influence and ministry. However, Selina offers us unique insight into the complexities of evangelical life within the established Church of England and then outside of it. Her relationships were significant and gained a hearing for the revival where it might not otherwise have gained entry. She maintained sympathy and connections across the range of personalities involved, including the Moravians, but most importantly, with George Whitefield. She established Methodism through chaplains and chapels. She brought the new birth into the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, where it was not always welcomed. And ultimately, she gave form and shape to Calvinistic Methodism. Well, Selina essentially maintained warm relations with the Wesleys, but gradually moved closer to Whitefield. At first, she rejected predestination and advocated Wesleyan perfectionism. She complained that Whitefield held forth above 2 hours upon the doctrine of election and reprobation, and that no consideration that I was yet able to see from anything he had said could have any weight. Well, that certainly changed. Selina's influence gained a hearing for the revival where it might not otherwise have gained entry, and brought the new birth into the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, where, as I suggested, it was not always welcomed. Selina began to invite her aristocratic friends to accompany her to listen to Whitefield. She was already at work among the fine ladies of Bath. Her doctrinal position was slowly shifting, and upon Whitefield's return from the American colonies in 1748, Selina appointed him as one of her chaplains. He was invited to preach to her aristocratic friends, and this closely aligned her with Whitefield and his Calvinism. Whitefield commented that he went with fear and trembling, knowing how difficult it is to speak to the great so as to win them to Jesus Christ. On the 30th of August 1748, Selina wrote excitedly to Philip Doddridge, another early pioneer who operated outside of the established church. I must just tell you that I have had 2 large assemblies at my house, of the mighty, the noble, the wise and the rich, to hear the gospel by Mr. Whitefield, and I have great pleasure in telling you they all expressed a great deal in hearing of him. Sometimes I do hope, for Lord Chesterfield. Well, Lord Chesterfield, together with Lord Bolingbroke, were regular attendees in Lady Huntington's circle of friends. They were at one level impressed. Bolingbroke described Whitefield as an extraordinary man of commanding eloquence, and Chesterfield said that Whitefield's oratory was unrivalled and displayed inexhaustible zeal. At one of her circle, Lady Rockingham prevailed upon the Countess to invite the Countess of Suffolk to come and hear Whitefield. Apparently, she sat out the sermon in silence, then flew into a rage, denouncing what she had heard. Well, Selina certainly experienced some resistance from her aristocratic friends, who were horrified by the enthusiasm and disturbed by some of the more chaotic expressions of revival, but also, of course, fearful of disruption to the social order. Duchess of Buckingham, writing to the Countess of Huntington, rather gave the game away. This is how she described what she had heard in one of these meetings. Their doctrines are most repulsive and strongly tinctured with impertinence and disrespect towards their superiors, in perpetually endeavouring to level all ranks and do away with all distinctions. However, not everything can be explained in terms of social history. The Duchess also made clear she understood the challenge of the doctrines of the revival. It is monstrous to be told that you have a heart as sinful as the common wretches that crawl the earth. She understood it. She just didn't like it. Now let's turn to the chaplains and the chapels. Now, to be a chaplain to a member of the British aristocracy was not particularly unusual, nor especially important in itself. But in this case, a prominent proponent of the new birth, George Whitefield, came into close association with an influential member of the peerage, with significant influence and contacts. This combination was powerful and was also the precursor to more formal organisation within the Calvinist part of the revival. And Mark Noel points out that not only did Lady Huntington devote most of her wealth to the evangelical cause, but she was a critical factor in bringing an evangelical witness to the English aristocracy. In the 1750s, the Countess supported Whitefield's fundraising efforts, first for his Moorfields Tabernacle and then for his chapel in Tottenham Court Road. Lady Huntington continued to develop her friendships with leading evangelical clergy and her ministry to the aristocracy. As well as the construction of the new tabernacle at Moorfields, Whitefield concluded there was need for similar provision in Bristol. Lady Huntington had a home in Clifton, the Bristol suburbs, and was also closely associated to a religious society that was linked to Whitefield and had many aristocratic members. The Countess actively solicited funds in support of the project. Both the new Moorfields and the Bristol Tabernacles were opened in 1753. Then in March 1754, Whitefield departed again for a visit to the American colonies. This was his fifth expedition, lasted till May 1755. Whitefield's regular absences had a significant and, to be honest, probably negative impact upon the development and leadership of the Calvinist branch of the revival. 1761, Selina opened a chapel in the fashionable south coast town of Brighton. The chapel was adjacent to a house which she had acquired. Whitefield had preached in Brighton, the resort was expanding, and Selina had come there in the late 1750s in order for her son Henry to convalesce from an illness. The opening of these chapels, Moorfields, Bristol, Brighton, raised the important question of the relationship of these chapels to the wider Church of England. Selina appointed numerous chaplains from the ranks of the evangelical clergy of the established church. However, unlike the Methodist meeting houses for the religious societies, the chaplains in Lady Huntington's chapels meant there would be regular services and celebrations of the Lord's Supper, indeed open to the public. An alternative, perhaps, to the parish church, a place where perhaps the gospel would be preached. The key dilemma which Lady Huntingdon faced was whether to register the chapels as dissenting meeting houses under the Toleration Act of 1689. If the evangelicals wanted the freedom to operate, which they desired, they would effectively need to declare themselves dissenters. Otherwise, they had no right to build, to staff, and to provide worship services outside the provisions of the established church. The strength of attachment of the majority of evangelical leaders, but especially those in the Calvinist branch of the revival, to the established Church of England, cannot be overestimated. There was, though, an ingenious solution to the problem. There was a long-standing and generally accepted practice within the Church of England of members of the aristocracy providing their own private chapels. These chapels were attached to their homes and outside the jurisdiction of the bishop. A chaplain could be appointed, and perhaps most interesting of all, members of the public could be invited to attend divine service. What a good idea. The establishment of a chapel outside the control and jurisdiction of the bishop, the appointment of a chaplain, the opening of the doors to the public to hear the gospel proclaimed. All of the early chapels established by the Countess of Huntington were attached to homes that she owned or leased. She was able to demonstrate that these were her private chapels, staffed by her chaplains and open to the public. At Oat Hall in Sussex, the Countess rented the house and converted part of it into a chapel. Shortly afterwards, William Romaine, another early evangelical, reported 100 communicants. Now, naturally, the Countess was not herself always present, and indeed sometimes the house was let to tenants, but you can see the principle that was used. In 1764 to 65, Selina moved to construct a chapel in Bath. She now had 3 chapels to supply and to deal with evangelical clergy who also needed to discharge their own responsibilities. More chapels were opened, Lewes, Tunbridge Wells, and elsewhere. Lady Huntingdon needed to make a longer-term provision for the supply of her pulpits. And so she began to work and collaborate with Hal Harris to implement a vision long shared by Harris for an academy or school for preachers. A building was secured near Trevithick in South Wales, and work was begun to enlarge and equip the property towards the end of 1767. The college would provide for both intellectual equipping as an alternative to the universities. Interestingly, 6 students had recently been expelled from Oxford for holding to Calvinist beliefs, and to be a place for practical preparation for ministry of the Church of England. The college opened in August 1768. To be fair, it didn't really go terribly well. The college had a shaky history over the coming decades, with both doctrinal disputes and concerns about spiritual vitality and indeed finance. But you can see the vision that lay behind this for the Countess. Whitefield, back in the American colonies, inconveniently died in 1770. So what I want to do now is tell you one story before we summarise and finish of the extraordinary case of Sparfield's Chapel. Here is a story about church planting. Here is a story about how the revival came into effect in this particular place in London, the opposition that was faced, and the tensions and challenges that it brought about. It's a most extraordinary story. 1774, the Countess became interested in the purchase of a building in the Clerkenwell area of London. Initially, this move was not successful, and so a group of businessmen stepped in, purchased the building, and registered it as a dissenting chapel. Northampton Chapel opened in 1777. Still faced the question of how was the ministry to be provided, and it was two evangelical ministers of the Church of England, Herbert Jones and William Taylor, who agreed to provide the religious services. The curate of St James Clerkenwell, one William Sellen, who shall we say was not of evangelical conviction, asserted his rights against the two clergy and laid charges in the consistory court of the Bishop of London. Jones and Taylor were convicted of preaching in a dissenting chapel and conducting worship in a parish to which they were not licensed. The preachers were silenced and the chapel closed. The Countess then made her move and acquired the lease. At its peak, even before the Countess intervened, up to 5,000 people were attending this chapel. The Countess wrote to the Bishop of London, stating that her purpose in taking the chapel under her protection was to prevent thousands from becoming dissenters. Alterations were made to the chapel to provide accommodation for the Countess. After all, this was to be yet another personal chapel of a peeress of the realm. 1774, Selina had appointed Thomas Hawes, an evangelical of the established church, as one of her personal chaplains, and he presided over the opening on the 28th of March 1779 of Sparfield's Chapel. Within 2 weeks, the same clerical opponent, William Sellen, instituted proceedings in the consistory court. Sellen demanded that Hawes required his permission to preach in the chapel. Hawes claimed the privileged protection of the rights of the peerage to provide chapels, and that the matter was outside the jurisdiction of the court. The court adjourned for 5 months. In November, the court reconvened, this time with a further claim, lodged this time against a second chaplain, Cradock Glascott, denying also his right to preach at Sparfields. The prosecution case was simple. A chapel with seating for thousands, a public entrance, and tickets sold for seating could not in any reasonable manner be construed as a private chapel. The edifice which Selina had built on, admittedly, a rather shaky foundation, was about to fall. In May 1780, judgment was given against Hawes. The case against Glascott, and of course, in time, her other preachers, was now entirely predictable. The only avenue open to the Countess to protect her chapels was to register them under the Toleration Act as dissenting meeting houses. Glascott removed himself to Devon, but a third chaplain, Thomas Wills, decided to secede from the established church. Lady Huntingdon had already realised there was little hope. She told her clergy supporters that she was ready to go to prison with them, and in a letter to a former student declared, "I am to be cast out of the church for what I have been doing these 40 years, speaking and living for Jesus Christ." What a way to go. Great statement. In his statement, Wills stated his grounds for secession from the Church of England. Oddly enough, doesn't mention Sparfield's Chapel at all. As so often the case with evangelical secessions from the established church, the reasons given were the baptismal office and the presumption of regeneration, and the burial service with the equally bold claim to eternal life. William Taylor, one of the original ministers, joined the secession. Hawes and Glascott did not. In a sense, there you get the tensions, don't you? Two people seceded, 2 people remained. Those same debates and tensions exist today. On the 9th of March 1783, Thomas Wills and William Taylor presided over what was in effect the Countess of Huntington's Connexion's first ordinations. 6 students. None of the well-known names in the established church joined her. The importance of Lady Huntingdon cannot be overstated. She exemplified both the strengths and the weaknesses of the revival: tenacity, commitment, passion, a love that did extend across the theological divisions, a desire to remain within the bounds of the Church of England were all markers of a significant section of the evangelical revival. Some poor judgments, lack of proper planning and provision, even a lack of focus, all contributed to the rather modest success of her enterprise. However, the gospel prospered through her. The evangelical minister of the established church, John Berridge, remarked on her death in 1791, "Another pillar is gone to glory. Mr. Whitefield is gone. Mr. Wesley and his brother are gone, and I shall go soon." Whitefield died, as I noted a few minutes ago, in the American colonies in 1770. Wesley lived another 21 years. Whitefield's regular absences rather exemplified the problem in providing for the long-term provision of the Calvinist branch of the revival, in distinction, of course, to Wesley and Methodism. However, the Calvinist part of the revival did continue, both within and without the Church of England. Whitefield was a giant, used by God in mighty ways. He was flawed like the rest of us, but his experience of the new birth, which fired his belly to preach the gospel at all costs, indoors or outdoors, a doctrinal commitment to the Reformation doctrines, and his ability to combine the doctrinal and the experiential in his preaching, all contribute to his long-lasting legacy. A giant indeed. Thank the Lord for George Whitefield. Thank the Lord for all of these pioneers, for William Grimshaw, for Selina, the Countess of Huntingdon, yes, for John and Charles Wesley, for Henry Venn, for William Romaine, for all of these people, for Howell Harris, Daniel Rowland. Thank God for these people that he raised up to proclaim the gospel in these extraordinary times. George Whitefield, a giant indeed. I do hope you have enjoyed these snapshots of the revival. God bless you in your own Christian lives and ministry.